upon the Prime Minister. Here.
Hi, am I audible?
Clearly, and you can start anytime you are.
All right. POI, unmute. Please unmute. I will accept one from opening or closing. We think that art that has moral value looks like in 5 things. Number one, we think that they have aesthetic value, which means that it's prioritized for commercial purposes. Second, it's mostly made by privileged people like cis, het, white male. Thirdly, is that there are lots of other arts with similar types or similar lookings. Fourthly, that it holds no sentimental meaning. It's just created just for the sake of, just making the art like for commercial purposes again. And lastly, there's also the rising trend of AI art where humans combine AI to make arts again for aesthetic purposes. Therefore, it has no moral value. The way we reduce it is under 3 mechanisms. Number one, we remove these arts from museums. Like for instance, there are arts that has no moral value currently in museum. We will remove it. We will go give it to auction, for instance. We will sell it. Secondly, we will cut budgets to record labels, publishers, labels that has published or maintained this art. And lastly, we would also not take away any more arts to be preserved, and instead we would prioritize to art that has moral value on the other side of the house, right? Therefore, I'm going to talk about 2 main issues. Number one, why art with no moral value actually harms the art in itself. But secondly, why then it's the role of the state to regulate these kind of arts. Number one, why art with no moral value actually harms the arts, the essence of art, right? There are 3 points of likelihood. Number one, we think that the preservation of art with no moral value, exactly the characterization is that they're not enjoyed by majority of people based on 2 big reasons. Number one, because that majority of people now currently prefer art with moral value because they have emotional attachment. Like for instance, they are made by disabled women, for instance, or disabled queer people, and I have sentimental value because I relate to this artist, for instance, right? And secondly, that majority of people would see that would love to have the meaning of art, like they would understand even better the art because they have interpretations of the art, and therefore they would see that this painting actually tells the story of a poor people in Afghanistan, for instance, and I understand that, and I actually every time I see it, I become emotionally attached to it, and that is why majority of people would prefer art that has moral value, and therefore art that has no moral value would not be enjoyed by these people. Therefore, preservation of this art by the state would be a waste of taxpayers' money. This removes the essence of this. Sorry, can I pause for a while?
Sure. What happened?
There is a shooting. I'm not sure what is the shooting.
Huh? Okay, are you okay? Hold on a second, guys. Okay, so are you sure? Are you are okay now and can resume?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, you
resuming.
are hold on. Just to recalibrate, my timer it's at 2 minutes. Everyone, it's at 2 minutes, yeah. So you have 5 minutes 20 seconds left. Okay, Ray?
Okay, thank you.
Okay, just to make sure you are safe, yeah. You are safe. Okay, Coolio. You have 5 minutes 20 seconds left. Resume the speech. Go ahead.
All right, so resuming 3, 2, 1. Therefore, it would be a waste of taxpayers' money, and therefore, like the taxpayers would want their states to actually give them taxpayers' money to actually something that's more important to begin with. Under their side of the house, and they would use this taxpayers' money to preserve something that's not even enjoyed by majority of people to begin with, right? But second likelihood is that preservation of art actually shifts the trend to aestheticism, because know that government actually sets the trend for art. If the government actually preserves these kind of art that has no more value, that means that government actually prioritizes aesthetic values over the moral value, right? This means of 2 things. Number one, that this means that people will try to use AI under their side of the house because, like, I would combine AI because AI actually makes better arts, better aesthetic arts, for instance, and the government doesn't care anyway. Government right there later after this preserve this art at the end of the day, right? But second of all, that under their side of the house, and government would also try to indulge in buying or preserving these arts, and eventually this would shift the behaviors of artists under their side of the house, because the artists would try to like, okay, I don't care whatever moral value that I make, whatever meaning and sentimental meaning, I just make whatever looks good for the government to begin with, right? Under their side of the house, then they would exactly remove the incentive of people to actually make art that have moral value. But last likelihood is that preservation of art actually removes the agency of individuals, because why? Of 2 reasons. Number one, because under their side of the house, then they would transform all of these arts transforms all of these arts into something that is actually very very plain and very unimportant, because at the end of the day, then they would essentially influence these people to actually change how their art is being made, right? But second of all, they also remove the agency of the society in itself, because the society are not able to choose which kind of arts under their exactly understand the house, that they would see on the museum, they would all see arts that has no moral value under the side of the house, right? This harms in three ways. Number one, we think that we negate the harm, because under our side of the house, that even if we remove the preservation, there is no emotional attachment of people to this kind of arts, meaning that people would be okay if they are actually seeing these arts actually not preservation, right? Under this side of the house, exactly then people would be less in society would be more harmed, because they would exactly see all of the arts in the museums, or most of the arts on the museums, that are no moral value under this side of the house, right? But secondly, after this is that harms artists, because artists now are not able to produce art that have moral value, because the society, the states would prefer this kind of arts that has moral value, right? But lastly, this also harms the government in itself, because that it keeps getting more and more money for them to preserve these arts. Before moving to the second argument, yes, Yoy.
Is the parameter of moral everything outside of your 5 points of immoral setup? Because we question who is the one that actually determines this parameter in the first place.
In order for this debate to run well, the opposition has to set up quote unquote a parameter for moral value, because that if opposition wants to argue that there's no moral value, then this debate would not have run. Therefore, I think that this is the 5 more objective parameter of moral, right? But secondly, let's talk about role of state to regulate. There are 3 main role states, right? Firstly, we think that the state works like an investment, meaning that all of infrastructure, meaning that education, meaning that all of that is an investment for states, right? The idea that this kind of art that has moral value in itself is actually dying, and it's actually, like they're not preferred by the people, for instance, meaning that the benefit in itself actually the benefit itself is not comparable to the cost in itself, because the cost of preservation of art is like millions. There are, for instance, if there are hundreds of thousands or millions of art, and every year you have to give like millions to billions of dollars to preserve art, that means that site itself is actually already backlashing the asset of investment, right? But secondly, state lets market operates. Under their side of the within that, at our side of the house, we let it that, okay, for instance, if the general public actually doesn't want this preservation of art, then what is the purpose of state keeps incentivizing and encouraging this kind of art that has no moral value? But lastly, within that, state also has the incentive to actually protect those people who are the most marginalized community, because state actually has the moral obligation for them to reparation of culture that is already being erased, for instance, or the marginalized people that they have failed to protect under the outside the house, right? So how do we protect and how do we fulfill these other 2 main issues? Number one, we give more opportunities for art with moral issues, with moral values, because the idea is that if we take down 10 pictures, 10 paintings from a museum, there are 10 vacant pictures, 10 vacant paintings, that you can fill it with art that has moral values. And outside the house, that is the ultimate benefit, that you will get more art that has moral value. And just outside the house, it is more filled with art that has no moral value. Secondly, at the outside the house, then we would also give incentives and preservation for exactly arts that has moral value, right? And outside the house, we have more budget allocation, because of course, budget is limited. You cannot always give the budget to both sides of the house, under their side of the house, right? Therefore, on the other side of the house, we give them more opportunities for disabled artists, for queer artists, for Black artists under our side of the house, right? This is important for 2 reasons. Number one, this is an exclusive benefit, because you will not get under this side of the house. But secondly, right? This is important because notice that we characterize to you the states in itself as an investment, and how they let the free market operates. At the very least, we told you that there is no benefit for you to preserve this kind of art that has no moral value for all these reasons affirmed.
I thank the Prime Minister for that fine remark. To respond, I call upon Leader of Opposition. Here.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, wait a bit. Everyone to POI, just unmute yourself. I wouldn't be looking at the chat. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, One, our stance on opening opposition is that we want to preserve art according to its segmentation. What does that mean? Is that instead of using moral value as a parameter, we will use as simple as different type of arts, i.e. in abstract art, obviously we cannot preserve everything, because I agree that I think what government said is neutral at best about resources, because we agree on our side there is also limited resources, which means that on both sides we cannot preserve everything. What's different is therefore, and what's the most important thing, is simply what is the most correct parameter, the most just parameter for you to decide what to preserve and what not. I think yeah, for example, if there is like abstract painting, and then there is also like realism painting, then we cannot like preserve everything, but we will take each of its representative. Let's say two from abstract art, two from realism art, and like I don't care any other type of art that I cannot mention. But the goal is that to preserve as many types of it as possible. Although we cannot preserve by number, we preserve by their representation. That's what OO wants to do. To framing, before I move on, first, I think as POI by my member, we need to ask about who will decide what is moral and not moral, because it is a this household debate. So that means we need to talk about what government is going to determine as moral or not. Because OG cannot run away with saying that government is going to be that benevolent. They are going to suddenly care about things like minority artists. I don't really get why that's the case. But second framing, I think we have to decide on what is the since limited resources, we just have to decide based on representation. One independent rebuttal, the other will be integrated. First, they say that the parameter is emotional attachment. I don't really see first why this is the most correct parameter of what is a moral art, because I don't think morality is determined by how many people relate to that. The idea is also that being able to relate to something is not even a parameter of preserving an art, because everyone have different thinking process, right? You cannot relate to every single different thinking process of each artist. Therefore, art is not meant to be understood until you know the moral value. It's meant to be enjoyed. So if you say that it's created for aesthetic purposes, I say that, well, I mean, okay, that's the whole point of art. Why is it when it's for aesthetic it's bad? Lastly, about AI, I don't think it's fair for us to have to defend AI art. I think most of people right now nowadays already understand that it's not real art anyway, and therefore, when we're talking about preserving something, there is also usually no urgency to preserve AI art, because it's usually on digital forms already. So like you don't need a lot of resources to preserve it. So most likely we're going to talk about like art in the past, and like those physical art that needs like a lot of like management for you to take care of its quality. Going to my first argument, this is going to be a principal argument. I'll talk about how this is going to be determined by the government, right? And why that's unfair. I think government and government interest is going to be dictated by a lot of things. It's going to be dictated by their political agenda. No matter whether it's a actually benevolent state or not, but their parameter of morality will be constrained to one type only. What does that mean? This looks like maybe you will eliminate art such as statues and painting that depicts nudity, because people feel like, well, it's just a dick. What does it mean? It has no morality whatsoever. But people who created that painting created that out of sense of self-expression. So I think the thing is also that we need to also understand that just because you cannot understand the meaning, i.e. just because government cannot understand the meaning, doesn't mean there is no moral value out of it, because you never know if there is moral value out of it. And again, so therefore, I think because you have different thinking process and that inability, you end up deleting art that actually has moral values. But even if OG wants to say that, oh, the one who determine it will be society, like what they say, I want to point out the contradiction. Because here's the thing, they say that we need to preserve art that most of people enjoy. Because if most of people doesn't even care about it, what's the point of preserving it? I think it's a contradiction, because you say that you don't like privileged artists like Chismail, you want to protect minority artists. But if your parameter is popularity by majority, why would minority artists be even known in the first place? That doesn't make any sense, because that means you still pander to majority, and instead you will stop preserving minority art. Because let's be honest, minority artists like queer individuals like women usually make niche type of arts that is probably not widely known. So I think you will deal at that. The second part of my principal argument is I will tell you why art shouldn't be preserved in that way. I think the art principle is that you cannot be constrained by the real world. I think that's the whole thing. But maybe Oji wants to say, oh, we are not disallowing people to make that art. We're just not preserving it. But your parameter of preserving things, when you say that these resources are how resources are allocated to preserve art, reflect the value that you put on it. So you still value art with morality more, which means that you put hierarchy on art, and that is principally incorrect already on top of how discriminatory it's going to be. Second contribution, right? I will tell you as to how it created less inspiration. Because let's talk about preservation and the goal. The goal is actually to educate the future generation. Because the idea of preservation is that you want to keep past arts to be constantly available. You want the next generation of artists to be exposed to it. So I think what's going to happen is that first, since you're going to significantly makes it become what majority of people likes, you're gonna have even less more arts, and that means because you also preserve a certain type of arts, it's also going to send a message to society that we need to we need to create this type of art because it's determined, like it has morality. I think it significantly diminishes the kind of inspiration that could have been gotten out of it. Because the important thing of having weird arts, like it's just splashes of color, or even arts that doesn't really make sense, like dancing or painting or music. Let's say that at a glance people just don't really get what is it. I think it's still important because still the number of it of like niche art is gonna be low. I think what it means is that it has no visibility and people wouldn't know it exists. And I think it's important in art community because every kind of progression, every kind of thing, like art that is just like bubbles or art that is like a mountains of candy, it probably at a glance doesn't mean anything, but this is an important progression of art that has to be recorded, that the young generation needs to know that our thinking process and how much we've broken our boundaries is this much. That's the value of preservation, and that's why the parameter cannot be on in terms of morality opposed.
I thank I thank the leader of opposition for that final remark. Now to close the case in OG, inviting Deputy Prime Minister.
Hello, can I be heard?
Yes, you can.
Okay, give me a couple seconds. Okay, POI through chat, I'm gonna take one from closing. Yeah, please. I really need an engagement from closing for this. What is morality in this sense? I think in the context of art, this looks like there's a meaning behind the art, not just a beautiful picture. There's a unique value that humans, that audience assign to that art piece beyond what is seen from the surface. Who then will determine whether an art is morally valuable? This is the biggest challenge for opening opposition. Obviously, the state, we're perfectly happy to say that, but also in consultation with people who are artists and art enjoyers as well, i.e. the good value of art in unity and stuff like that will be preserved. But this also protects minority art. The reason for that is twofold. One, there are unique incentive and for museums, for exhibitions to show niche minority art, because that's what makes them unique and that's what makes them different from other exhibition. Some exhibitions portray Badui art, the other exhibition portray Dayak art. You make unique market segmentation. But secondly, that's also how most states work, i.e. they care about the struggle of minority. That's why a lot of states provide representation to minority, i.e. in the parliament and in the regional government. The biggest push that they give was that, but the state cannot understand. Like, this is a very unmechanized low blow. Like dick pics that Gio said, with no moral value. If the state cannot understand what is the meaning behind a dick pic, I would argue that audience are also not likely to be able to understand what the value behind that is. And what that means is that art becomes much more censored, because children are obviously not going to be allowed to see these particular art pieces. And therefore, what that entails is that you create even more substantial harm, not only that because people cannot enjoy the art, but also because, the artists, for example, who generally want to create these arts for no moral value at all, are unable to get their art, generally published to a lot of people as well. So we answered the biggest challenge that is technical for opposition. The first thing I'd argue is on freedom. And I think the challenge for opposition is that, some artists just make that based on their expression. The first thing I want to note is that freedom is not a priori. The art, unlike popular belief, is not just, I don't know where there's the thumb, but it's not just an expression of human. But what makes an art is that it has to be put in a medium that will be interpreted and that will be shared for other people's senses to receive. That means that there's a public value of art as opposed to just a private value of art. That is to say, the state can do censorship when the art is inciting violence, when the art is inciting a segregation of individuals. And in this case, what Ray told you and responded by their side was that this creates substantially massive trend of art shifting to only, prioritize the beauty of the art. That creates more market incentive for most artists to only create art that is aesthetically pleasing, because that is generally what the market wants. And insofar as that's true, that creates art to be even more elitist, because only people who get good brushes, good colors, people who are not fucking colorblind are able to create these particular art pieces that are able to be enjoyed by a lot of people to begin with. There's a state responsibility here, right? Because insofar as there's a public side of art that will influence how people think and literally will influence how people, consider their ideology, then the state has to step in and intervene to rule. So freedom is not a winning argument in this debate. In fact, we flip that and we argue that freedom is worse in opposition insofar as you create a market trend that will shift to only making art that is based on aesthetic value, which doesn't make sense. Why? I'm going to answer this now. What is the real value of art and why is art uniquely valuable? I'm going to take closing before that. 3, 2, 1. What is the real value of art and why is art uniquely valuable? This is very, very important. I'm going to take you after. Art is not important or valuable because of beauty or aestheticism, but rather the moral and experiential value of such art piece. I'm going to tell you 3 reasons. This is important. Why art is not for aesthetic value. 1, aesthetic value is non-unique, because you get aesthetic value from literally a lot of other things. You see beautiful people, you see beautiful landscape, and stuff like this. So art should not primarily be as a medium for you to please your eyes or please your ears, because you can get those elsewhere. Second, if art is only important for aesthetic value, then that doesn't make sense, because we assign unique value to art in a way that, like this, we think that plagiarized art is bad. Although the plagiarized Mona Lisa looks exactly the same as the Mona Lisa that they put in the fucking Louvre. And what that means is that we assign not only because art is beautiful, or both art can look exactly the same, but we think that one art is going to be substantially worse, not because we think that aesthetic value is the most important, but because there's a background behind that, because there's a moral hazard of you trying to plagiarize someone's art to capitalize on yourself. And thirdly, the first inception of art was not pretty. It was just like paintings on a cave from like some animals. Those are not pretty. But what that means is that people share their experience and unique value that they assign towards the art. But what that shows is that enjoyability becomes a deadlock breaker in this debate. Because for far too long, art that are abstract, that I think opening opposition wants to push as their main case, is often only enjoyable by rich people putting those on their own fucking walls, for example, because they can afford those art, because they can look at those arts, pretend like they feel good and understand something about it. While in our side, we make sure that the art that is published or art that is preserved, that is accessible for everyone, is actually understandable, is actually actually enjoyable for a lot of people. People don't gaslight themselves that they are stupid if they don't understand a certain piece of art. There's a certain threshold that government will assign, that if the art has no moral value that people can necessarily assign or people can necessarily relate to, that is not something that we should be preserving in our side. Opening go.
If you say that art that incites violence is not good, how do you know it's inciting violence instead of talking about suffering of people, suffering of war or plague? Are you gonna get rid of that as well?
No. Like clearly it's like this, right? We told you that moral value that people necessarily, like assign towards a certain art, i.e. art made by minority, or art that is, depicting the struggle, the gore of like feminism, of slavery in the past, are not often likely going to be banned in our side anyway. Like it's mostly uncomparative at worst, because in opposition, you're not gonna ban any of these certain arts. You're gonna preserve anything, which one doesn't make sense because you have a like clear, like a trade-off that you're gonna focus on the beauty only. But I think secondly, you also like create no more like moral value anyway in their side. Secondly, the most important manifestation that we argued was an AI art. There's a significantly rising usage of AI to produce the art piece because of the shift established absent this proposal. Because people generally associate art with beauty. That is why people necessarily, just use AI because that's an easy way out. Because they can enjoy the art without them necessarily putting too much effort. What we uniquely do in opening government is that we put human unique art as a higher pedestal, because only humans are able to create art that is moral. Only humans can assign a unique emotional and unique experiential value to art. It doesn't matter if the art is more beautiful or not. We told you that aesthetic value should not be the winning argument in this debate. Insofar as we prove that human art is going to be substantially more preserved and more enjoyable for everyone, like we generally win the debate. Affirm.
Thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that fine remark. Now to close the case in OO and opening exchange, inviting the Deputy Leader of OP.
Hi, can I be heard?
Yes.
Can I be seen?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Before I start my speech, really glad and maybe cursed to be here as well, but pleasure is mine. I ideally will take a POI from closing for cross-bench engagement. Just unmute yourself. I will be reading the chat. Hang on. Oh, yeah, that's it. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Let's clarify one thing here. We don't have to defend an AI art because we know that it's shitty. We know that, this is something that the general society and even to some extent governments constantly berate. Even if it is aesthetic, we don't care. We're talking about the kind of art that individuals make. And I think that's the one that's going to be preserved as well, because that's the one that actually takes effort and resources to preserve, right? So let's clear this thing up and talk about the correct kind of preservation in this debate, because preservation of AI art is not going to be hard. You put it in a Google Drive folder, done. We're talking about preservation of art that actually requires effort and resources. 2 questions to prove why this is going to happen. 1, on an individual impact of artists and which one better preserves the legacy. 2nd, talking about society and the communal meaning behind it, right? Let's talk about artists and which side better preserve the legacy. Let's individualize the impact as well. We note that, sure, art is an expression of your feelings and grievances, but this is a very charitable characterization. We can admit that if an artist makes a good piece of art, it might still be relevant in their lifetime at best. So the framework behind this is the question of which ones transcend your lifetime. Which art after you die are you remembered for? Sure, it's going to be very limited. It's going to look like Da Vinci, Van Gogh, Picasso, etc. I think these are the kind of artists that have not just an aesthetic value behind their art. Sure, their art looks good, but their art is also very significant for the time period. The art is significant because it signifies a turning point in what art is defined as. That is our parameter of why it should be, or what should be preserved, what defines preservation, right? So I think if society values it, I think it is therefore unjust to take states' arbitrary valuation of what is moral, because it is exactly that, arbitrary, right? OG's case shoots themselves in the foot, because when they try to define the issue of minority art, they tell us that no, this is going to have like consultation. People will still have a state interest to preserve minority art. Let's talk about that and what that actually looks like, right? Even if you have consultation, it's going to be one of two things. One, tokenistic, because the states pick and choose which minority art to represent, not based on significance, but the ones that show positive representation of that. So they're not going to show art made by Black artists that represent like the suffering that Black people face. They're going to pick and choose art from Black artists that represent unity between Black and white people, because that is what states would want picturization to look like, right? When in reality, this is a very significant time period, period of art. This is maybe very aesthetic as well, but this is a very significant period of art because it signifies the turning point of what that looks like. Songs that talk about the suffering that Black people face. Songs like "Fuck the Police," which was literally banned in a concert to the point where they ended up singing it anyways and then got arrested afterwards. That's the kind of art that we want to preserve, that is not going to be preserved on their side. But two, I think this is like art is objectively best looking. What art is objectively most significant. They talk to artists and talk about what is most significant towards their time period, etc. And most likely, this is what's going to lead to like even an accurate parameter of preservation on our side. So we don't think this is an exclusive benefit on government. If anything, we think that we flip the harm and prove why preservation on our side is going to be like on a much more objective parameter on that. But I agree, objective is not an a priori good. We prove to you that this is actually going to be beneficial because we represent the art that is most significant. We represent the art as that is most representative. That's why Gio's parameter is so important to talk about. First clash proven. Yeah, I'll take Justin.
There's a misconception here. Opposition did not prove why the art of "fuck the police" will be preserved in their side anyway if the government is that majoritarian-centric. What we proved to you under opening government is that art with moral value, depicting the struggle of minorities, but art that people assign a
Sorry,
unique
that's 15
enjoyment
seconds
for.
already.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the second clash. I'm going to answer that in the second clash on like why society is inherently going to value art already, right? This engages into the market trend of aesthetic value. I think Gio already engages into that and proves why aesthetic value doesn't become the absolute only parameter. But even if it becomes like a main parameter, but let's talk about aesthetic value and what society actually values art to be like, right? The fact that OG talk about morality as a meaning and Justin's POI saying that it's majoritarian centric, let's point this one thing out, right? If you sketch a very realistic flower, or if you sketch something that is hyper realistic, that might only be aesthetic because it's just a flower, it's just a pencil, etc. But the fact is that there was effort put into it, that when you look at that art and you perceive it with your senses, when you listen to a song and you perceive it with your auditory senses, it's nice. It's nice to look at, it's nice to hear, etc. And I think that is what society care for most, right? Because art talks something that is inherently subjective insofar as you as an individual probably want to enjoy art because you like the sound of it, because you like to look at it. You think about the grievances of individuals, like the meaning and the moral value behind it. Art as a statue might be nice because it was something that's the world that's the counterfactual that government pushes onto us, right? You hyperthink something that is inherently subjective to the point where it no longer becomes an enjoyable because it becomes a battle of how you perceive that art. So if your parameter is that art should be enjoyable, we do that not just proving that this is not exclusive on government, but we do that more because you don't overthink art, because you simply look art and believe that this is something nice. You take a look at the general audience insofar as everyone can enjoy this piece of art that is represented. And if individuals then attach a individualized meaning behind it, that is individualized, but we don't want to make moral value that parameter, because art is something to, be nice to look at. And if you look at it, you might have an individual impact towards it. You might have an individual grievance attached to it, but that's on you. And more importantly, you do so because you like looking at that art. We think that we best preserve this principle. I don't think opening government case proves that at all. Very, very proud.
I thank the deputy leader of opposition for their final remark to open the case coming from CG and closing exchange, inviting member of Gov. Here.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are, and also
That's good.
visible. Okay.
Thank you for the confirmation. POIs, wait a sec. Let me fix my desktop so that I can see everyone in the screen. Please do raise hand, use the raise hand feature, utilize that. Yeah, oh wait, shoot. I need to switch out my charger first. Aduh, okay. Right. Pronounce he, him, but refer to me as MG aja. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to do two things on top of my speech. First, I'm going to identify what's lacking from the opening debate. But second, I'm going to also differentiate what's moral art and non-moral art. Because this haven't been done by the opening debate, and it's very vague, and they debate on that. But first, what is the problem with the opening debate? The problem is both sides, either OG and OO, they lack the urgency. OO specifically told you that there is going to be preservation of different kinds of art. That is to say that you take two from this certain art, two from this certain art, whatsoever. The question is, why is it very important for you to preserve this art, and what message does it send to the people if the purpose for you preserving it is to show it to the people whatsoever? They haven't characterized to this, and never necessarily, for example, managed to contextualize what is necessarily going to be the benefits that they claim on their side of the house. OG is better because OG at the very least explains to you why it's very important, why it's costly, for instance, to actually preserve art, therefore you ought to select it. But their main identity talks about how, okay, you ought to protect these minority arts, but haven't explained to you why it's very necessary, for example, to actually protect these minorities arts. CG is going to take this extension away from opening government. But second thing I'd like to do is also to differentiate what differs from moral art and non-moral art. Two things. One, that there is a meaning to moral arts specifically behind the creation of those arts, and it probably symbolizes something major, i.e. that one screaming paint, like a screaming painting, because I forgot who it was made from, that symbolizes the expression of depression and like anger in general. You can see this through the description of these arts in the museum. But secondly, that there's a moral message that you ought to take from the for the viewers, right? That is either the general public, art experts, or people who relate to it whatsoever, that ought to get that meaning. But what is moral meaning in this context? It's important to note that this means that you ought to get the notion of what's good and what's bad, and what you have to unlearn from the current situation, or from the current status quo, from looking through those arts. Therefore, it's very important to note that this specific traits differs moral art and non-moral art. One identity that is going to be championed under closing government is the fact that there's currently a vast development of art. That is to say that there's different kinds of arts growing, and we are going to explain to you why this is the case, why this is very important to protect. First contribution I'd like to do is to explain what is the development of the world looking like in terms of art, and even in the social context of the creation of art in general. Three things. One, there is a vast increase in the number of artists creating art, because the form of art that is being made as well is also growing. That is to say that there is For example, more musicians, there's more accessibility towards these kinds of art, there's more paintings whatsoever, so the number in general increases. But second, there's also growth in more different kinds of art. That is to say that's now it's digital art. Now some people actually create murals. Now some people actually express their art through architecture. Now people create statues that are more advanced in comparison to the other because there are newer materials that are actually created to use these arts whatsoever. But thirdly then, is currently the unique trait of the modern world and why it differs from the previous arts. Therefore, you ought to not preserve all forms, you ought to not preserve all arts that exist in the past, is that right now there is a recognition of more struggles of the people due to its progressivity, i.e. right now you see rising conversations about gender minorities. Right now you see more rising conversations about indigenous communities and how their lands are taken. You see more conversations about racial minorities and their issues with police brutality in the US, for instance. But what is the second thing I have to characterize as well is what is the problem in the current status quo? Three things. One, currently, preservation of art is costly. OG tries to explain this, but we need to explain why it's necessarily harmful to the context of the growth of art. It's important to note that with the development of art that I've already contextualized before, we need to ensure that we need to be more adaptive in catering to more forms of art. This means that there's newer forms of trying to preserve these arts, newer substances that is actually going to, be bought by these art museums to actually, spray or paint through these newer materials, because there are now like growing forms. It's not only that right now people only use paintings, but there are more forms of art. This means that this indicates the fact that there are more attempts, there needs to be more adaptive attempts to preserve these kinds of arts. If we don't do this, we fail the function of preservation. But second thing, the current focus is emphasized too much on low moral arts, right? Only on the aesthetics of it whatsoever. This creates so much focus on aesthetics, and it's problematic in two ways. Number one, individuals no longer care about the meaning behind the art. Therefore, there are a shift in trends in people actually creating that art. But second, this takes away the unique access given by art, which is giving the platform of catharsis to the individuals. In context where you have to select which to preserve, it's important to note that catharsis is very important because this is the most vulnerable function of art that these people usually, for example, access through only specifically art. This means that from catharsis, they ought to send something to the society and tell them that something is wrong and therefore they need help through these forms of art. This function is taken away the moment that you allow, for example, aesthetics to arise and become the most important thing in the current status quo, especially that right now people do have that trait. Before I proceed to the third problem,
If you say meaning equals to you can attach meaning, moral equals to meaningful, you can attach meaning to any kind of art. Splash of colors can be meaningful for different people. So your parameter doesn't actually filter anything.
there is different meanings and there's different depth into certain meanings. This is a fiat that they have to take, because if it's true that all arts can have all different same meaning, for instance, like this debate will not happen at the very first place. They need to bite the bullet as to why that's likely the case, for instance. But thirdly, vulnerable artists' art is now at stake for its preservation. OG tries to talk about this, but we're the ones who mechanizes it. It's important to know that these forms of catharsis is very important to preserve, noticing that morality is used in society to learn why something is good or bad. That is to say, when artists are able to send to society through their art that something is good or something is bad, we ought to learn and unlearn something from those specific arts. That's why it's very important. Oo told you why they want segmentations of arts whatsoever, but precisely because right now that's the case and there's no significance, and these are the problems that derives from it, we take this debate on top of OO as well. How do we help the form of arts under our side of the house? Threefolds. One, we allow more access to preserve moral arts that function so much. Second, we allow perspective in society to shift, because one, there's a meaning and cry for help, and they value that now. But second, that arts ought to be remembered by future communities that will exist. But thirdly, we shift the focus and we preserve the most vulnerable function, which is catharsis. Because this is very important, because when you're a minority that holds so much grudge and stress, you allow stressors to be released in comparison to whatever aesthetic value that's trying to be defended by opposition. This is extremely different from OG's logic, because we explain at the very least how individuals opt to art for this function and we defend this function. Important for two things. One, we value the most vulnerable, but second, this accepts the struggles of minorities, which is the utmost value proud to propose.
I thank the member of government who, with that fine speech, and now to respond, member of UP, here.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
For POI, progress just through chat. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2. We think arts are very personal. We can't generalize society just because it is beautiful, just because it's aesthetics doesn't mean it doesn't have the moral value and the meaning. Picasso painted powerful portraits of his friends, which is we can dictate that this is abstract, but as well as this abstract, they have the meaning and moral value. They painted as well as the poor and abandoned friend to explore the themes of human misery and social alienations. Opening debate is talking whether the art has moral or not. CO will explain, regardless this has moral or not, this significantly is very harmful and immoral because it takes away agencies and robs away free will because there will be censorships. Only one standard of art that have to pander and taken away the essence of free or open interpretation of arts. We don't want that. This principle is harmful regardless the majoritarian of government or what types of art will be aided, but also disrupts the art industries as a whole. CO will stick the status quo where there are many types of museums that government have, which museums instilled by moral values, which museums with have free interpretation on aesthetic, which people just can enjoy the arts, but probably some people feel attachment and feel there are the moral value on some buildings or some gestures in the paintings. Probably they can see stories behind the arts by themselves. These are type of status quo we will still add it. In status quo, government already cherry picking the arts to be preserved in the status quo. For instance, museum is not picking every art to begin with anyway, because exactly we agree on the characterization of limited resources and budget and also prioritizations. By these motions on government, it allows more censorship and limiting and worsen the status quo. That is, we don't want that on CO. Why the discussion to determine on their side isn't effective before jumping to the explanations on CO. This is engaged to Oge and CG. First, the idea of government ruling this going to be create anti-critics because only the characterizations that the arts will going to be only have moral value anti-critics. We agree with OO on this regarding what value that will be included by the government. Most likely is what beneficial for them. But the missingly is why it's very harmful when you significantly reduce it. Why? You give too much power for the government to also shifting the creating narrative to for the people that have the moral value and anti-critics. In status quo, the discussion have more bargaining power. You ruins it on government side of the house. But number two, even if there's an art community, you can go into discussion and consultations is bad. Why? Because everyone will always think and say that arts are the most important thing and important art. But number two, they will always tell you at best it will be incredibly a major turn at the end of the day. But that is also why the reason we cannot generalize types of people who perceive the arts, because OG consider there will be free interpretation and morality based on discussions, because art is very complex and personal interpretations. Why this is important? This mechanism all harms regarding bad morality because we analyze how the discussion goes will not be very effective. But number two, this better engage with government case because we tell you that this kind of this tell you other than the discussion, this is harming and worsen the status quo. Why the action of significantly reducing is very harmful on the practicality? Why this is significant reduction looks like? Criticizing artists that make art would don't have less quota for the considered non-meaningful. Like it is very likely because status quo already checking picking anyway on the preservations. But lastly, shifting trends of everyone will do morality arts instead of liberty of making arts and free interpretations. Why this is harmful? One, it limits the liberty. Number two, huge critics that makes less artist diversity. But number three, it's saturation of the market of artist stuff that reduces the capacity of the amount of the free will of people who can also create arts that they have that want in the status quo. How this affects the actor and why this is very harmful. This is the new extension coming from causing opposition. Letter one, it may also discourage artists from taking risk and exploring new ideas if they fear their work will not be preserved anyway. They feel it becomes uncertain, the art will not be appreciated. Number two, it maybe creates a public opinion on different platforms also because people will habituated and dictated by government that the art have to be every valuable and appreciated is the art that only have a moral value to begin with. These individuals platform outside of the museum or outside of the government platform will also going to be undermined because the changing of the narrative of the people inside of these countries as well. This is why it is very harmful by worsening the status quo by the platform of the artists for themselves. But number three, no, artists have limited options to create their arts, like because when one in or not, they have to have moral on their art. It is very coercive actions because we say creators of art have to be freewheeling of themselves. Some artists, sure, they want to have clear clear messages. Some artists, sure, they want to push the minority struggle, but some this may not. Why it creates an artwork that is exclusionary in the status quo on their proposal? The end goal is huge pressure to make more value art. Why did it become harmful other than robbing away the agencies and free liberty expression of the art? Not everyone have moral story to share. In favor to a certain degree of artists, this is not an actor motion, so we don't have to define minority. In so far, this is exclusionary. This is very bad because because it generalizes every type of art and also the creators. The shifting are very harmful. But number B, the best case on you have one story, meaning you cannot produce more. You limit the choice of it. You cannot survive on the competitions because it meaning the less diverse of types of art. That's why the production of art is lagging on their side of the house. But before that, yeah.
So if status quo is already quite exclusionary, the only way the excluded artists can get their arts preserved is from opening government, because everyone will be able to assign moral to their art, and the arts that have moral value in it will be preserved in our side. Your side does not change anything. That is a losing extension.
I don't think it is. It kind of not make sense on government what they can co-opt the benefit of including minority arts, because it's simply they and limiting the options, because they're changing the narrative of this art have to be moral value. We already tell you we cannot generalize stuff of people in free interpretation. We cannot generalize artists that have to create a moral story. We don't see this kind of make sense. How this affect the society? Number one, it becomes society preference or interpretation is just only moral value that have to be painting. We say this is very boring because paintings on arts is not the only source you can find the moral value. You can also find the moral value of the story, other medium, other platform. It becomes the very boring and it reduces the essence of the art. But number two, society will likely to not buy into the art. This is because on the last perceptions on the historical perception of the art is not only about the moral value. It means it disrupts the whole market of art itself and very saturated by only one standard of art. But why then it very incredibly harmful? We already told you on the less artists will get appreciated, less jobs, less people will listen to art itself. Why this impacts when after the debate on CO? One, we say status quo is already unjust for types of art and artists to begin with. Don't make it worsened by government proposal, just only stated by government and only dictated by government. We're proud to oppose.
I thank the member of opposition for that fine remark. Now to close the case in CG and government bench, inviting GovWeb. Here. Hold on. Is this okay? Try again, Jones. Tadi agak flaky ini. Try again. Hello.
Am I audible? Hello.
Yes, you are audible and visible. Go ahead.
Okay. Can you mute me? Thank you. Yeah, I have POIs through chat as well.
Like nggak sih?
Yes, lagi Jones. Lagi.
Same here.
Probably.
Oh, lagi. Can you just leave your job?
Can you just leave your Zoom? Okay.
I lagi suruh Rizky leave Zoom. Hopefully that helps. Okay.
It helps with the voice.
Kalau misalnya if it's still like
It is still lagi. Coba matiin.
oh,
Atau pakai Zoom-nya Rizky.
I'm disconnected from your Wi-Fi. Wait.
Yes, tadi Rizky aman.
Ini tab.
Pindah.
Hah? Oh iya, main itu, ayo itu. Ya udah. Enggak bisa.
Jones, this is fine by the way with you turning off the video, so we'll probably can try that.
Okay.
I mean,
I'll just turn off my camera.
I love seeing you, but kayak I'm sorry.
It's okay. All right. Sorry for that. The new alternative coming from OO is that you can use representative on each genre to preserve art. Two things. One, I would say this is symmetric. We are not going to eliminate a genre of art because we value how art depicts in their mind in abstract art, for example. There's still more value in abstract art when the artist depicts themselves breaking apart or detached from their mind, and they're able to paint that feeling and that emotions into art. So I posit that we still have art in each genre anyways, because we still like have certain values on all of those kinds of like morality on certain arts anyways. But secondly, I will question what kind of art will OO preserve. There will still no parameter to preserve art, meaning you just randomly pick two paintings from each genre. Why is this harmful? Because it diminishes the genre of state art. If people look at abstract art where it's just lines everywhere and there's no any meaning behind it, rather than just saying, oh, it's aesthetic, people lose interest over that. Because if you want aesthetic, go look at Pinterest and don't bother going to a museum, for example. The harm is clear. People are less likely to be interested in that genre of art because it loses the value of that painting. People question why we're standing around looking at a banana tape on a wall where the description has like no certain values on what it's going to be about. That's why under out of the house, it's far easier for the government to have certain obligation for them to make people have more interested in art, for example, and for them to actually like care about certain genre of art. And that's why on how we have certain parameters on how we weigh those kinds of preservation is through certain moral certain moral values on said art. It's easier for us to like gain all of those kinds of understanding on how people can depict on how their emotion and feeling and mindset on those kinds of pieces on canvas, for example. That's why it's easier for us to have certain like attraction from people or just artists in general for them to be able to pursue art again, especially for like certain like people or like certain minorities who they can still have like more moral values, which is like I'll explain later. Secondly, they talk about how art is meant to be enjoyed and we want aesthetic art as well. One, we agree on that. This is a metric. There's no fear that people won't enjoy the Screaming Boy, like by the Screaming Boy by Bach or something, or Van Gogh's Starry Night, where he depicts a warm night with a massive fire to symbolize his state of mind in the asylum. So I wonder why people won't enjoy our art as well. But secondly, this is about weighing now, right? Which one is able to preserve art better? We say, oh, it's a bit too idealistic and didn't link back to the emotion on how they want to preserve every single type of art. We explain to you on how that's not quite possible, and on the worst case on how to preserve, we ought to preserve those sense of morality or like those kinds of moral values of art instead. Third, lastly, they talk about how minority and niche art, etc. What? Again, this is a metric. I flip this logic and posit that we have more minority and indigenous art because when you look at Sacagawea and see what a strong, badass woman from an indigenous community and felt her aura and influence through all her oil pans, we still get appreciation from minority paintings. But secondly, I think there's also far more a lot of morals or like whatever like values that they want to put in minority and indigenous art. Because when you look at how they paint, for example, when you look at how indigenous art still uses like rocks, for example, or like dirt, when they like try to paint something, we still have more values in it because you can understand their like lifestyle, for example. You can see what kind of like suffering they went through their art itself. So I think there's far more minority and niche art that exists under Art of the House because there's far more meaning towards it instead of just some like random paintings on a like campus. But lastly, why should preservation be based on morals then? Two things. One, the interest people to make moral art is the core principle of art itself. The reason why people paint and put colors on a painting to make all colors combine together and deem it as art is because they are painting out of their identity and who they are. Each brush is supposed to symbolize how they feel and their passion. So that's why the core principle of art is what you put values of that art itself. That's why we say this parameter is justified and okay to use. But secondly, then they say splash of color could be meaningful. This is not true. They literally consider that their art just for aesthetic and like just enjoyment purposes, and that's what they want to preserve. So I will argue that not all paintings have certain moral values in it, and even if there are, then there's just certain ways on which one of like art that are more easier for us to preserve. That's why like all responsible for always out. Let's talk about CO then. There's some analysis that were exactly the same with O, but certain things that are different is about how open interpretation of art is gone in status quo, which is their main contribution. One small framing to kick out CO. Sure, prehistoric aesthetic art is gone, but modern art will still exist. Like all modern artists are still able to paint whatever they want. Like if you want to be like aesthetic, be my guest. If you want to make open interpretation of what a dick is, go for it. There's no correlation at all under CO regarding the motion, which is the preservation of art on like those kinds of like oil painting, for example, or like this kinds of prehistoric art. If you want to draw a banana or copy Mona Lisa, then just do it. No one is restricting you to do that. That's why from open interpretation itself, I feel like a lot of modern artists can still have their ability for them to actually draw whatever they want. But we are talking about the preservation of those sorts of moral values art that already exist from the past, and we're having a really hard time for us to, for example, like have certain budget for us to like maintain every single art and have more interest of like newcomers or new artists for them to be able to be interested in those kinds of art, like the rest of the art itself. But let's bite the bullet then, which is still okay, because that's still the core principle of artists anyways. Artists will still share the art that holds a certain meaning for them, so the harm under CO is still quite marginal. But second point then, they talk about how people's interpretation of art now is morality and moral values. We question under CO. What do people evaluate art on under their side? Not moral values? Like, isn't that the prerequisite of how art enjoys and scholars or general society look at art anyways? There's no comparison under CO at all on how people's interpretation, just like how there's no benefit at all under CO itself. Under Arts of the House, we tell you it's far easier for people to be able to enjoy certain art for when they look at how meaningful some one painting from a canvas is, when they depict a whole entire history of certain artists, for example, or a certain prehistoric time that are like that we didn't feel today. The fact that they can grab your emotion and the fact that they can feel all those sort of things that happen is already very meaningful on the Arts of the House. And those kinds of moral values exist, and that's why we want to preserve this kind of art. Let's talk about the differences under OG now. First of all, 2 big points. One, PY on O.
Okay, all art, according to Rizky, is a form of catharsis. This cannot be your parameter because there is virtually no delta. We question then, why then the definition of morality is catharsis? And if so, you are the one that's making the debate, not mutually exclusive.
Yeah, I think if all art can be catharsis at the end of the day, I think exactly the weighing from that is just finding which are like prehistoric art time are like have more moral values in it itself, right? So exactly, if a lot of artists, for example, have a lot of like prehistoric art and those kinds of all certain art have moral value in it, then we can all like preserve those kinds of art itself. I think the delta here itself is that once some art doesn't have good moral values in it anymore, or like it doesn't adequate enough towards like what people's interest in itself anymore, I think it's okay for us to not preserve it based on the urgency of like budgeting or whatever on preservation, which I'll talk about literally now. So, OG, 2 big points. One, talk about you're wasting taxpayer money by preserving non-moral arts and we have better budget. So I think oil painting is an ass to preserve. Like there's certain dust and that touches the paint, and you need a new layer of covering to protect the original art. The canvas wood might die off, so you need to meticulously replace the wood from the canvas and replace it into a different canvas. You need to use certain chemicals to retain the color back. These procedures took like hours if you're lucky. Imagine doing this with thousands of art that exists. We say there's certain art that loses its values and that we are okay to reduce the preservation rate for the art of the other artists. For those reasons, CG.
I thank the government whip for that final remark. Now to close the case in CO and the debate in its entirety, calling upon Op Whip. Yes, I can hear you, and now I can see you.
Okay, my audible.
Yes.
PI preference just unmute. Most likely take one from opening. We got pilak. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. 3 framings that is important towards this debate. A, I think that art is incredibly personal. Why this is likely? Because simple, you cannot generalize how society thinks. OG falls because like they generalize people just want this morality arts. OO falls because they want to like have no morality in the arts itself. You cannot generalize how society thinks. That is why Stanley personal agency is so important. But secondly, the trend of status quo that art is commercialized, right? There's a lot of things that art is buying. The art is so pricey and etc. etc. You don't want to disrupt that. That is why our industry analysis is so important. Talking about how society will not going to buy in towards your art exactly when you limit the preservation. But thirdly, if people really love art that have the value, we say that they will likely to preserve it anyway. I don't get the urgency of the case of government. That is why they lost this debate. But flagging then, A, opening is out because they want to conduct how society thinks. It is an incredibly huge burden. And I think CG is also derivative towards the case in OG because I think that it's 100% contingent on OG analysis. We are confused because if some people still enjoy those catharsis thing, why then you want to limit the preservation, right? And it's such a shame that GovWhip dismissed our industry analysis. That is why CO have the free will to actually win this debate. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to weigh why Stanley industry analysis wins us the debate immediately.
what Stanley told you, 4 things. A, we mechanize how the decision of the morality is bad. Whatever the scenario that Gov wants, that the DPM said, whenever government conduct, we mechanize why this is going to be bad. But secondly, even if there's consultation, there's going to be bad because exactly how society, how all of the artists will think that their art is the most important. That is why the discussion will not going to be effective anyway. That is why it will likely to resolve into majoritarian. This is why we mechanize OO harm. But secondly, we also picturize what is significantly reducing is incredibly harmful. We told you you likely to criticize the ones who the artists who don't have don't make the art who are, have morality. You will likely to like incredibly limits the quota of this particular artist. You also robs the agency of this particular artist. Thirdly, this narrative limits the agency of an exclusionary because there's an immense pressure for you to actually make art that have the morality, which shows to you have not all artists have the capability to actually make those art morality. This means you will likely to affect the production of the art because how moral story of the individual is actually limited. At best, you have 2 moral stories you should share, but you will likely to only have 2 art, right? This means you actually have to less art. People are bored and losing huge audiences in terms of the market itself. Comparatively, on our side, we accept all choices of art because we don't want to disrupt the market itself, right? The way that you should take of these things is 3 things. A, the action of that is of significantly reduced. We should do it as incredibly harmful. But secondly, we don't disrupt the market itself because we accept all choices of art to be preserved. We make sure that we have more choices towards the audiences. They will likely to buy in and they will likely to not bored by the art. But thirdly, answering CG, evolution still happens because there's a lot of mechanism like popularity, mechanism like review of the paint of the colors itself. Whatever it is, this still there, right? That is why CG's benefit is not exclusive. CO wins this debate. To comparison then, I'm going to compare the whole Gov bench with closing opposition regarding of opportunity cost. Secondly, I'm going to engage towards opening opposition why we are better in terms of like mechanizing. In terms of like CO versus Gov bench on the issue of opportunity cost, what did they told you holistically? They told you no moral art is bad for art itself. Secondly, government will likely to harm by this because there's going to be very, very costly. Secondly, they want to protect the minority. Fourthly, trend is actually very, very shifting. 2 flagging, 5 response. We said it's going to be contradictory because when they say that people wants it, but they say that art moral is dying, we say this is not logical because if there's a demand, why it could be dying in the first place, right? If people love it so much, why it's going to be dying? I don't get the urgency on the Gov bench. But secondly, you simply cannot generalize how everyone will perceive the art the same way. OG case can only run if all people who would likely to love this particular art who have moral value. I love creating abstract. All people have the capacity to actually make abstract itself. That is why you can generalize how society thinks, right? That is why 2 flaggings that make the whole entire Gov bench lose this debate. 5 response then. In terms of costly, we say that it's not significant of the difference because we say that on their side of the house, they're still likely to make museum. On our show the graffiti, what is the difference of the money? Sure, they say that millions of billions, but like still happens on their side anyway, right? And by the way, making museum could also be beneficial for tourist extraction, for instance, right? This means more museum equals more money though, right? We see that government also have the rationality to actually make proportionate museum for all of the particular art, right? But let's flip the idea of the tax. They said it's going to be not going to be deserving for the society, etc. Note that the artist itself also pay tax. That is why they deserve to be preserved, right? Their own art and their own sweat, blood, sweat, and tears, right? That is why they flip the whole idea in terms of like the costly thing. The trend shifting later shift all the time. For instance, like back then there's the Renaissance into now the digital art, right? We question why is it going to be harmful. It's unclear to me, but it's even worse on your side because you want art to be always going to be rigid, right? This makes mono society want to buy in terms of this art. But thirdly, when they say that no moral art is actually better for society, how? Not clear. But for the artist though, we say it's exactly hard when you harmful when you limit the agency of the artist itself. We say incredibly harmful when you exactly limit the preservation itself. But fourthly, when they say there's a discussion, we say this is very taken for granted because we prove you how the discussion will likely to bad because all artists will think that they are the most important. Then most likely you will likely to resolve into voting, and this will likely to become majoritarians that is in favor towards the majority within itself, right? That is why all Gov case is already out of debate. How do we out weigh them. A, we explain to you the action of significant reduce is incredibly harmful regardless of the morality. Because we say that significant reduce interval, criticizing, have less quota, shifting the trends to everyone to do morality and having pressure of it, right? We told you that at best, it will likely to robs away the agency of the artist because there's a significant limitation that disrupts the production of the market itself. The way they should take for this issue is A, their harm is something that is not significant. Secondly, their benefit is also weird and false because we mechanize how the discussion of choosing the morality will likely to become bad within itself. And the industrial level will likely to like disrupts and make less artists to actually have those appreciation to begin with. Lastly, CO and OO, on the issue of principle. A, they say that principal art should be preserved that way. Secondly, it's going to be limiting expectation. Three flaggings. A, no mechanization on how the morality is bad. It's just assumption. We mechanize that. Secondly, I think the emphasis is always going to be society. Well, you cannot generalize it. Same mistake as golf bench. But thirdly, they only throw you a limit of inspiration, but CEO is the one who mechanized why limitation of inspiration is actually harmful. The way that you take why we are above opening opposition is A, we mechanize the harm better on our side regarding how the industrial level of analysis, society will not buy into your art in the first place. Secondly, we say the emphasis on our argument regarding industrial analysis is the most tangible harm that's happening in this debate. But thirdly, we shows to you why limiting inspiration is harmful because at best the comparison that OO did is saying that there's a lack of inspiration. We shows to you how limiting those inspiration will likely to become harmful of the agency and the liberty of the artist. Protect those artists, preserve all of their art. So proud to.
I thank the opposition whip for that fine remark, and by extension, all the debaters here. Thank you very much for the amazing debate. Now, cross hand and then make your way out of this board. JJ, you might